understand that many entities were bound to the HAARP system, which is an entire array, not simply in Gakona, Alaska, but around the world. There were different HAARP arrays that were built, antenna arrays, if you will, of high-frequency activated auroral atmospheric resonance research projection programs, which is what the actual acronym HAARP stands for. So these are ionospheric conductor arrays. And when it comes to the what they were truly for, at this point in history, they are used to bind entities that can be released all at once, with the occult equivalent of a nuclear football. So thus the Vox Vocis Arca Arche. So there was this research that was done by Michael Aquino into the cultivation of potential powers of personality. This was what will take us to the VRIL in its perverted sense that he was using it for. He just felt that there were latent metahumans among us, latent supermen, and that they could unlock the power of their minds, which could be released, perhaps even involuntarily, this power, without their wanting to release it, through music resonating at 3 to 7 cycles per second. So when it came to Michael Aquino and his school of thought, the U.S. Army, of course, hired a lot of people who were involved with the human potential movement. And there was a movie that was released at the same time as Star Wars, circa 1977, called The Brain Machine. And this is while Aquino was acting as an unofficial consultant for George Lucas and his Star Wars film, from which they spoke of the Force, which is just a watered-down, popular understanding of the VRIL that was only later on developed through multiple layers of the Star Wars saga. Did they even bring it up to some kind of par with the reality of this kind of chi or orgone power? But at that time, of course, there was a mass-marketed tool for attaining hypnotic and other altered states of consciousness through pulsed light and sound stimulation. And that was the use of stroboscopic light, the so-called dream machine. And basically it was based on a visual phenomena described about 200 years ago by the Czech-Austrian, a Czech of Austrian nationality, the anatomist and physiologist Jan Evangelista Perkin, and or Perkinier. And he was one of the best-known scientists of his time. People used to be able to write letters to him from outside of Europe, and all they needed to do was, instead of an address, just put Perkin, spell his name out, Purkyne, Europe, Perkin, Europe, and those letters would be delivered to him just by that. So all of this became the basis for further scientific studies on how the visual brain works, and ultimately of such developments was born the Project Domini Appellationum, or the Master's Call, a program under the Defense Intelligence Agency that was a umbrella for other experiments in the oral manipulation of humans through the voice, through noise, through the call. So then what happened, of course, was the infernal machine was ultimately developed the trigger mechanism for all of the HAARP arrays worldwide. And once this was developed, ultimately I stole it from the government, and now it's mine. This is what people were referring to when they're saying, incredible claims require incredible evidence, and therefore turn it over. And then again, it forces us to touch on the life of the Jewish-American conspiracy analyst May Magnin Brussel, a scion of the May Magnin fortune, the Magnin fortune of I. Magnin fame. And so she was the daughter of this rabbi, the granddaughter of I. Magnin, the clothing store empire. And basically what happened was she was ultimately murdered by Michael Aquino. But before that, he tormented her ceaselessly just as his gang stalkers attempt to torment myself. In her case, of course, basically her daughter on December 16th of 1970 was killed in an automobile accident, which was simply a warning for her from Michael Aquino. And other threats were launched when she exposed the linked elements of the U.S. military to satanic cults and practices. It was these death threats that eventually forced her off the air. Now, she was obstructed, but she was still undaunted. Her work was featured in the publication The Realist, which was secretly financed by John Lennon, for those of you who don't know. She continued producing broadcasts from her home, and she privately mailed them to subscribers. Now, when she went back to regular broadcasts, what was so strange about it was this was in 1983. And it's rumored that she knew about me then, or knew of me. She was working at Kazoo in the Pacific Grove, California. Now, all of this concluded these broadcasts on June 13th of 1988. But what's so significant is that my Japanese name is Kozube. That's what I've told people is what the Japanese laugh at, not out of any malevolence or derision. It's simply that when they hear my name, they've never heard a name like that since the days of the samurai. It's a name of nobility, the kind of name that it would be, as I've said, like a Westerner either hearing somebody with a thespian name out of a Shakespearean play that no one has heard since the days of the Elizabethan era, or more properly analogous to like someone meeting an American and you ask him what his name is and he says something like the name of an Old Testament prophet like Obadiah or Ezekiel or something of that nature. It's just people aren't named that way anymore in Japan. So when the Japanese hear that name, it's like they've stepped back in time, and they laugh about it because they never hear a name like that outside of a samurai movie. But since my name is Kazube, her station that she worked for was spelled the way my name is romanized, Kazu. That's the short name, the diminutive for my name. Kazube would be Kazu. And so she was working at Kazoo in California. It was all very strange, spelled exactly the same way my romanized Japanese name is. But she predicted many things before they happened because of her keen insight that she developed through her investigative expertise. And it ultimately cost her her life, but not before she was tormented beyond all reason. One was through her ghosts, or rather her daughter Bonnie's ghost. And that was basically in December of 1970. May's daughter Bonnie was killed at the age of 15 in an automobile crash by I won't call it an accident, because this was the driver of the other car intentionally rammed the car her other daughter was driving. Both her daughters were in the car. One was driving. The younger one died. The man who crashed into them intentionally was a soldier in the U.S. Army at Fort Ord. He went AWOL 2 weeks after the crash, returned to his home, was never sought by the authorities. He got away with murder scot-free. As for Barbara Brussel, her other daughter was in the car. Her legs were severely injured and she suffered from a broken back, face injuries, broken nose and arm. But what happened was that the daughter who had died, Mae Brussel, kept parts from the car in her home. And this was a link. It is a tether plasmatically. You remember what Peter said about the lady, of course, who I will also address but briefly, who was exuding from her vaginal area, the effluvia, the kind of ectoplasmic discharge that was, as my mother described her, Maria Orsic, the medium for the VRIL Society. And so this was, of course, someone who began what she was doing a few years before my mother was even born, Maria Orsic. But when it came to Mae Brussel and this kind of ectoplasmic connection with what she had in her home, that's what Aquino took advantage of, just like he did with Eastern Airlines that was owned by one of Martin Bormann's relations. And Martin Bormann's relative, Frank Bormann, owned Eastern Airlines, and he was a former astronaut. So as a man connected with the Reich in exile, and Martin Bormann specifically, Aquino was out to destroy him because the Reich is the enemy of the Edomites. Now, what happened was that they planted a bomb on a plane, Flight 401, and many people died when it crashed in the Florida Everglades in 1972. And so because Aquino ordered engineers that he had infiltrate Eastern Airlines, cannibalize as many parts as they could from that ghost flight, and place them in all the other planes of Eastern Airlines, people began seeing the ghosts of two men in particular, the Eastern Airlines pilot and his chief flight engineer, who had died in that flight. And over a period of years, they terrorized the staff and passengers to the point where basically Frank Bormann ordered the complete information shutdown. The situation was so volatile that as CEO of Eastern Airlines, he threatened to fire any employee who publicly discussed these sightings. And these ghosts, of course, were being manipulated, as Aquino told me, by himself as a necromancer. And he could do this because of the ectoplasmic connection of these cannibalized parts in these other planes. So when I called Frank Bormann to inform him about this, he ordered all those parts removed. He ordered a massive search for whichever parts could have been cannibalized from Flight 401 to be removed from all the rest of the fleet. And once he did that, these sightings stopped. So when I called Mae Brussel and told her about the other Lockheed L-1011 flights, which used salvage parts from Flight 401, and presented to her the fact that what Michael Aquino was using was holographic imaging technology projected by satellites into her own home, linking to the parts from her daughter's car that she had to present her with the vision of her dead daughter, who continually was begging her to kill herself, to join her in heaven. Mae Brussel told myself that she was just about to blow her own brains out with a loaded gun. But she took my call. She felt compelled when the phone was ringing to take one last call, and it was myself. So I stopped her from killing herself. Now, ultimately, Aquino killed her via directed energy microwave weaponry from a van parked outside of her home. She ultimately developed a fast-spreading form of cancer that way while she was investigating the Presidio scandal and exposing Michael Aquino personally. Michael Aquino often bragged about his murdering her. He never knew the part I had played in saving her life in the first. Now understand that if any conventional engineer or physicist or scientist were handed these parts from these Lockheed L-1011s that had been cannibalized from Flight 401, they couldn't have ascertained anything that would have given them any information they could understand. If they had been given the parts from the automobile Mae Brussel's daughter had died in, they couldn't ascertain anything that would have explained to them the appearance of her daughter's ghost before her, used as an enslaved soul, a puppet of necromancy by Michael Aquino. The same with the Vox Arca, or ultimately VRIL technology. These are not technologies that are accessible to conventional physics, to conventional science, or conventional engineers. This is the realm of the arcane. This is the realm of arcana. So when it comes to what my mother had explained to me, she said that a man named Bulwer Lytton had written a book about the VRIL country that she had learned about and her travels through Inner Asia. And he simply Europeanized the reality of this realm within the earth. In fact, he rendered it an underground country that was accessible through Newcastle, England. In his book, he said the access was through a mine that was going down through, well, basically to a broad level road illuminated by artificial gas lamps. Now, my mother said that was his way of making this accessible to the Europeans. But she said that the way she understood it, through her short time in dealing with these people, was, she said, in America, these people, the VRIL, the Americans call them Mothmen. The Americans interpret them as the Mothman. Now, basically, she said that in this realm, which the Nazis ultimately encountered and ultimately conquered that realm, she said basically it's a realm of their architecture is mostly Egyptian-styled columns, but she said there was all sorts of strange vegetation, red golden color, many lakes and rivulets, gigantic ferns, tall cane-like plants bearing clusters of flowers, and enormous fungi, of course. And she said that as well there were many savage reptiles that roamed these caverns, enormous crocodiles, herds of a kind of deer or elk stag, large species of what she said was a tiger with broader paws and more receding forehead than those found in India, and that this tiger haunted the shores of the lakes and pools and actually fed on fish, and was really becoming very scarce at the time that she encountered the Nyaga, which were the serpents of ancient days who had taught, well, really seeded the Buddha. The Bodhisattva was of serpent heritage. And this ancient race of the VRIL was similarly wise because of their ancient age. And their world was also full of singing birds, usually kept in cages to serve as musical instruments. And there was a beautiful species of dove with an immense crest of bluish plumage that she said one was kept upon the surface world in the temple of the Nyega. Now, in terms of the cities, they had streets with buildings on either side that were separated from each other by gardens with all this rich-colored vegetation, strange flowers, and that the gardens were divided by very low walls, but the buildings all seemed Egyptian. That was the closest kind of comparison she could make, with columns that mimicked the aloes and the ferns themselves, and that the floors were made of large tessellated blocks of precious metals, partly covered with mat-like carpeting and abundant cushions and divans. But they had technology, open lifts descending from the ceiling, leading onto the upper floors, and that these walls were decorated with spars and metals and uncut jewels, encasing large unglazed windows, and that with the touch of a spring they were covered by a shutter made of some substance less transparent than glass and opaque. Therefore they could block out what was an eternal light that was simply phosphorescence from the stones themselves in these valleys where these dwellings of the Nyaga and the VRIL were settled. So most of the houses, of course, had spacious balconies, but most of all, she said she remembered in the visit that she had in the time that they were conversing with the Nyega. She said mostly she remembered that there were delicious fragrances that were emanating from elaborately sculptured censers that were made of gold. Now, all these inhabitants themselves, the VRIL, she said they could heal with the touch of their lips, and that their books were very tiny. They were kept in libraries, much like the European ones, but that they used robots as servants, and that they had a telegraphic system, a metallic plate inscribed with strange figures that enabled them to send telegraphic messages from their homes, and that they believed in this sort of electric, magnetic, and galvanic force called the VRIL, from which they took their very name. And that, she said, that VRIL in the hollow of a rod directed by the hand of a child could shatter any building. Now, the most important office in the VRIL country was that of the provisioner of light, to ensure that the light was always readily available, that men and women had equal rights, but physically women were stronger, and therefore the heads of state, that children were used in factories as manual workers, and that their entertainments were either sports in the air, because all the VRIL were winged, and the music was in public halls, theaters in which ancient dramas reminiscent of the Chinese were sometimes enacted. And she said that the VRIL lived to be about 130, and when they die, they're cremated, and before cremation, their coffins are marked, lent to us, their date of birth, and recalled from us would be their date of death, and that their day consisted of around 20 hours, 8 silent hours, 8 earnest hours, and 4 easy hours. But physically, they resembled all the images that you would see of demons. The demons that you would see on Etruscan vases or the walls of Eastern sepulchres. That their faces were like that of the Sphinx. Red skin, large black eyes. That they had very musical voices. Tall but not gigantic, and when they folded their wings over their breasts, the tips would reach their knees. That they wore under tunics and leggings, some thin, fibrous material. Several tribes existed, each of about 12,000 families, and each tribe occupied a territory sufficient for its own needs. But most of all, of course, she was brought to meet them because of her expertise in linguistics. That basically, she said their language was common, one common language between them, several dialects based on exchangeable phrases. All I remember her telling me was that "grill" meant like an assemblage or union of things. "Un" would mean like a house. Thus, "glun" would mean like a town. "Ne" would be something antagonistic to life or joy or comfort. Thus, "naz," or "nax" if we were to Romanize it, would mean darkness. Or "gnarl" would mean death. Or "nania" would be sin or evil. And that there were 4 cases linguistically, about 3 with varying terminations and a 4th with a differing prefix. She would say it was like a singular, and a plural would be like on, from on, anom, the ano, 2-man, anam, man, hilan, oh man. Like, more like, oh man, like almost like an exclamation. I mean, she would remember things like this with extraordinary detail. Ana, men, anoi, 2 men, ananda, men in general, or hilananda, oh men, as like an exclamation. But the one thing she said, despite all this, was that literature for them was a thing of the past, that the writing of history and fiction was forbidden, considered detrimental to their happy society, that nothing was permitted to disturb their state of joyous equilibrium. And this was the way Japan was in ancient days. It was called Wa, the land of equilibrium, the land of inner peace. That the religion was simple, that they believed in the creed that they professed, and they all practiced the precepts which the creed inculcated in them. Their God, divine creator and sustainer of the universe, was seen by the VRIL as the wellspring of VRIL, the energy, transmitting every conceivable idea, because the capacity for creating a thought on one's own is impossible for common man. The VRIL believed they were amphibious, descended from ancient enormous frogs, really. So that being said, there was a council of sages. They had a proverb: no happiness without order, no order without authority, no authority without unity. And that rudeness was unthinkable among the VRIL. Even the youngest children were taught to despise any vehement, emotional demonstration. Now, she said that the information she was able to communicate to Adolf Hitler and the Germans about all of this, and there's some more. I'd have to look through what notes I took when she spoke with me. I can't find them right now, but I'd have to look for them and maybe hope to find them, and perhaps I could share some of this with Peter later privately. But essentially, the VRIL Society was born earlier than information related by my mother, but certainly she helped the society change, kind of adapt to what information she was able to bring them as well. Now, of course, when Belwer Leitang wrote his book in which he was trying to communicate what he had learned, it was titled The Coming Race. It was published around 1871, and it was a novel about a small group of German mystics who discovered the truth about this race of supermen, the sphinxes, the mothmen living within the Earth's interior. And he inspired the founding of what was called the Brothers of the Light, the Luminous Lodge, the VRIL Society. Because this super race had built a paradise based on the VRIL force, this form of energy so powerful that the older beings had outlawed its use as a potential weapon. It was the year that my legal father was born, the man who raised and guided me, Chief Petty Officer George Joseph Henry Dietrich, 1919. It was in that year of his birth that Karl Haushofer, he was the man who founded the Brothers of Light Society in Berlin, but they changed its name to VRIL. And as Haushofer's VRIL grew in prominence, it united three major occult societies: the Lords of the Black Stone, the Black Knights of the Thule Society, and the Black Sun. And they chose the Hakenkreuz, the Hooked Cross, the swastika, as their symbol of the Black Sun, based on their Buddhist connections through Karl Haushofer's studies in the Orient. And while these societies borrowed some concepts and rites from the Theosophists and Rosicrucians and various Hermetic groups, they placed special emphasis on the innate mystical powers of the Aryan race, the connection between the Japanese and the Germans through Asian India. The Aryans of northern India had migrated oceanically to the Isles of Japan, and via the land routes through Iran, which is simply the Greek word for Aryan, into Europa, and therefore the Aryan connection between the Germans and Japanese. The VRIL and its brother societies maintained that Germanic, Nordic, Teutonic people were of Aryan origin, like the Japanese, and that Christianity had destroyed the power of the Teutonic civilization. Now, a few years before my mother was even born, in 1921 was when Maria Orsic, the medium in the VRIL Society, began transmitting spirit messages originating from Aryan aliens, quote unquote. She was saying there was a connection to a kind of home star in Aldebaran, and another medium, simply known as Sigrun. Two classes of people on their world: the Aryan master race and a subservient planetary race, evolving through mutation, climate changes. That a 500 million years agone, the Aryans, also known as the Elohim, the elder race, began to really emerge from the inner earth, which is truly their source, as opposed to the stars. On Earth, the Aryans were identified with the Sumerians, carving out an empire for themselves in the inner caverns of the world when they retreated from the surface again, after gifting or bequeathing mankind civilization. The VRIL force, of course, is ultimately derived from the Black Sun. Now, in terms of this huge black hole that is at the center of our galaxy, at the center of every galaxy, it's what causes galaxies to form around the massive collapse of gravity that draws all the stars around it, the material that the stars are made of. In the inner Earth, it's known as prima materia, providing light and radiation to the inhabitants of the inner Earth through occult means. And, of course, the VRIL Lodge understood that whoever learned to control Well, control of the VRIL. Become as master of himself, those around him, and the world itself, if he or she should so choose. So this ancient force had been known among the alchemists and magicians as the Chi. In Japanese, the Ki. In Egyptian, the Ka. In the Nordic, Aryan, Teutonic terms, the Odic force. By the time of scientific compartmentalization, and Dr. Wilhelm Reich, he had isolated it as the life energy of the Orgone. And of course, it's the astral light. The members of the VRIL Society were well aware of its transformative powers to create supermen out of ordinary mortals. So such members of the lodge as Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, the other Nazi leaders, they prepared the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth, to become as a master race. And this way, they would be able to ultimately be worthy of conquest of the lords of the inner earth. And so just the year before my mother was born, 1922, the members of the Thule and VRIL built the Jenseitsflugsmaschine, the otherworld flight machine, based on the psychic messages from the intraterrestrials. That was when W.O. Schumann, Schumann, of the Technical University of Munich, was in charge of the project, until it was officially halted in 1924, the year after my mother was born. She was born in December 5th of 1923, so it was basically, as soon as she was born, it went black. Off the books. The craft itself stored in the Messerschmitt Aircraft Company's Augsburg facility. In 1937, after Hitler came to power, he authorized the construction of the Rundflugzeug, the round or disc-shaped vehicle for military use and spaceflight. And it was in April of 1942 that the Third Reich sent an expedition composed of a number of its most visionary scientists to seek a military vantage point in the inner earth. And this was at a time when the Third Reich was putting maximum effort into the drive against the Allies. But of course, the inner earth and Unterland was paramount. Now, of course, this was where, again, sourced the early models of the so-called flying saucers. And, of course, there was a cooperation between the Thule, the VRIL, and the Black Sun from the late 1920s. And ultimately, by the 1940s, contact had been established. My mother had helped in that with some of the linguistics with this ancient civilization. So underground bases were established with a truly alien intelligence. And that was how the Nazis mastered anti-gravity spaceflight, established space stations, accomplished time travel, and developed their spacecraft to warp speeds. So that's pretty much what I can say in a summation. And hopefully that will put into some perspective what I understand about the VRIL. And hopefully people now understand why it's very difficult to try and even put this into terms that a conventional investigator would understand.
Well, you did very well. There's only one problem with it, is that now I have to go listen to it and